بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum everyone. My name is Hira Khatak and I'm a rising second year student at Ursinus College studying neuroscience and politics. This webinar is the third part of the Khair Center's three-part series, Putting a Face to the Name. Just a reminder that you can comment any questions that you have as the conversation continues on if you wanted to chime in and ask anything from our guest. Today's webinar is a little bit of a different perspective, but inshallah it will be just as insightful, and it will be on the racial injustice in our communities, especially in incarceration. The previous webinars have provided us with an insight into the hardship that Black Muslims face and their efforts to help the community around them. Today we are joined by Seema Saifi, who will discuss more of the legal obstacles that African Americans face in the criminal justice system. Seema is a graduate of Cornell University and Fordham Law School. She currently works as a senior staff attorney for the Innocence Project, a nonprofit organization that works to exonerate individuals who were wrongfully convicted. And Seema also directs an Innocence Project clinic at the Cardozo School of Law, where she teaches law school students in courses such as legal writing and Guantanamo habeas litigation. Assalamu alaikum, Seema. Did you want to introduce yourself beyond that and talk a little bit about your job and your organization?
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you, Hira. Sure. So the Innocence Project, like you said, is a legal and criminal justice resource center. Our lawyers work to exonerate the wrongfully convicted, which is just a fancy term for proving someone's innocence after they've been convicted of a crime. And we also have a policy department that develops and implements legislative reforms and other types of reforms to help guard against wrongful convictions in the future. Many of our clients have spent decades in prison as innocent men and women, many due to egregious police or prosecutorial misconduct. And the Innocence Project primarily uses DNA testing to try and prove someone's innocence, but many of our cases are from the 80s, 90s, even the 70s. And so DNA may no longer be available, or DNA may never have been part of what was collected during the crime. And so we often have to engage in investigation to uncover new evidence or constitutional violations to challenge the basis of someone's conviction. And so our legal department has about 250 cases at any given time, and we have 6 lawyers. So each individual case can take years, and that's just from the day it lands on our desk. And so many of our clients have proven their innocence after 10, 20, 30. I have a client right now who has spent 40 years in prison as an innocent woman.
Wow. I just wanted to start off by asking specifically your work with the Innocence Project. Like, what has that taught you about mass incarceration and the issues in criminal justice? As you said, you have a lot of cases at a time, and it takes a lot of time for all of the process to go through. I just wanted you to talk about what that has taught you about the racial injustices in America.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the United States has 2.3 million people locked up in our prisons. And the NAACP actually had posted this advertisement that was very powerful that said, welcome to America, where we are home to 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. And so that sign is really telling. The city of Philadelphia actually refused to post and display this ad in the Philly airport. And so the court found that was an unconstitutional suppression of First Amendment speech, and it led to the NAACP winning a lawsuit against the city of Philadelphia, and it was ultimately allowed to display that really important ad. And the sign is really significant because the United States locks people up at higher rates than any other country. We are living in a carceral state. And this Friday, June 19th, is actually Juneteenth, which marks the end of slavery in the United States. which is also remarkable because slavery in the United States hasn't really ended. It has just evolved. And Michelle Alexander has described mass incarceration as a system of racial and social control, which is why criminal justice in this country is a racial justice issue, like you said, because of the staggering racial disparities that permeate the US criminal justice system. So there's a report that was issued 7 years ago that says 1 out of 3 Black men will go to prison at some point in their lives. And that's compared to 1 out of about 17 white people. And anyone listening to that might think, well, Black people commit more crimes than other communities. And that is completely unsupported by empirical evidence. So there's a number of factors that lead to the disproportionately larger numbers of Black people in prison in this country. And it has everything to do with systemic racism. So if you just look at New York City, which is where I work, so I can speak more about that, we see this. So for example, the NYPD goes into communities of color, projects, and engages in large-scale arrests for drug crimes. You don't see the NYPD going into Columbia or NYU dorms where there are a lot of white kids doing the same or much more dangerous drugs. Research has shown that Black people are 5 times as likely to go to prison for drug possession as white people, despite the fact that their data shows there's similar rates of drug use across races. The exoneration data is pretty stark, and it suggests that innocent Black people are 12 times more likely to be convicted of drug crimes than innocent white people. And so in addition to the over-policing of neighborhoods, you can just look at the way we treat drug addiction in this country. So when drugs were flooding neighborhoods of color, we insisted that drug addiction is a criminal justice issue and people doing drugs should be in prison. When we saw the opioid addiction in rich, affluent areas, we called the addiction a public health issue, and people need to go to drug treatment centers. And there's also significant collateral consequences of putting so many Black and brown men and women behind bars. And it reveals why mass incarceration is just a new form of slavery. So one example is felony disenfranchisement laws. The majority of states in this country prohibit people who are incarcerated for a felony from voting. And some states actually, when you get out of prison, you have to petition for restoration of your voting rights. It's not automatically restored when you've completed your sentence. So what it really does is it takes large segments of the Black population out from voting in this country. And we have seen that has a significant impact on who is being elected into political office in this country, all the way from local elections up to, of course, the president.
Okay. So based on these, ridiculous numbers of 12 times as many people being convicted and high numbers of Black Americans being accused of crimes that they didn't even commit, what psychological and community impacts does that have on already disadvantaged Black communities in America, and how that continues that cycle of injustice?
I mean, that's a great question too. If you just look at what we're seeing today, people are calling it, a moment, but this moment has been a long time coming. I mean, the struggle that Black Americans have been fighting, they've been fighting for decades, and people are exhausted. And we still have a long way to go, but I do think, and I'm happy to go into some of the changes that we're seeing already, but I do think that there are some changes that are happening that are promising. I think that it does take such a stark toll on, what is going to create change. And unfortunately, we saw, someone in our own community who was just charged in New York City. There's a Muslim woman who graduated from law school last year. She was charged with throwing a Molotov cocktail into an unoccupied police vehicle. It was a property crime, but the prosecutors are going after her in an astonishingly, egregious way. But it's interesting because it's like, well, when police engage in that kind of brutality to human beings, no one's getting arrested, but somebody throws a Molotov cocktail on a vandalized, unoccupied car, they're trying to seek imprisonment for up to 10 years. So I think that the fact that people who you would consider to be, these are law school graduates who were driven to a point where they felt like they wanted to engage in some other, response, because nonviolent, actions were, not really effective, shows just how desperate people were to try to effect some change. And we do need to engage in, protest, nonviolent protest. It is not helping the protesters when people go and, damage property and hurt police officers. None of that is helpful and none of that is legal. But what's interesting is that you see this response in droves and droves and droves of people, not just in Minneapolis, but cities across this country and across the globe. And so I think that shows that people are tired.
Yeah. You mentioned some of the changes that are happening, especially recently with this whole movement. And I think it's important to mention the influence of media and especially social media in the idea of creating this instant in time in which a lot of people are able to post on social media and show their support in ways that, while they are able to still social distance in this time, they're still able to make that impact. Can you talk about some of those impacts that have happened recently?
Yeah, so again, because even though we are a national organization and our clients come from, who are people who are challenging their convictions from all over the country, I have a little bit more knowledge about what's happening in New York than Pennsylvania. But on Friday, Governor Cuomo in New York actually signed into law a package of police reforms. And many of the reforms are things that advocates had been pushing for years, but got no traction because of a lot of opposition from police unions who contribute to the campaigns of elected officials. And so because of the grassroots movement in the United States, we are beginning to see reforms that would never have seen the light of day. So for example, New York has this law, it's a civil rights law called Section 50A, and 50A prohibits the release of police personnel records unless you have a court order or the officer's permission. And so if somebody was disciplined or had, anywhere between 1 and 80 complaints against them for anything from, excessive force to sexual abuse to, anything, the law effectively hid those disciplinary records of police officers from public view, making it virtually impossible for anyone to know whether a particular officer had a history of abuse. And that was just repealed on Friday. It was routinely used by people in power to shield police misconduct from public view. And what's interesting is Derek Chauvin, who is the police officer who murdered George Floyd, he had past misconduct complaints lodged against him. And those records became public because Minnesota, unlike New York, did not have a law barring the disclosure of such records. And so New York, until Friday, had been the worst in the nation in terms of hiding law enforcement misconduct and discipline. And so the repeal of this law will provide more transparency on police misconduct. In New York, it'll help address some of the lack of accountability for officers who engage in misconduct. Another reform that passed on Friday in New York, which was inspired by that Amy Cooper 9/11 phone call incident in Central Park, makes false 9/11 calls made against protected classes a crime. And so I don't know if viewers are familiar with this, but there was a man who was just bird watching in New York City in Central Park, and this woman had a dog who was not on a leash. And if you're in that part of Central Park, you have to put your dog on a leash. So the guy told her, can you put your dog on a leash? She refused. She said, my dog needs to, get some exercise. So he gave the dog like a treat, because he keeps treats to, because a lot of owners don't like when people give their dogs a treat, but he didn't like that the dog was on a leash. So she started calling the police, and he was a Black man. And she said, I'm going to tell the police that an African American man is, threatening me and my dog. And he started putting this on video. So she said, stop doing that. And he said, he just was taking a video. He wasn't talking to her. He wasn't talking to her dog. And she said to the police, there is an African American man. He's threatening me and he's threatening my dog. And you could actually see her on the video pushing her dog down because her dog was trying to run around. And so it not only showed that she was trying to get that man, she was actually putting him at risk by telling the police falsely that a man was threatening her, and then specifically calling him an African-American man, knowing what the police are going to think when they hear a white woman calling and saying that there's an African-American man on the line. And he took a video, he said, thank you. And he posted the video. And so she actually ended up turning over her dog because people said that she was abusing her dog. And so she felt, you know, it was an interesting dichotomy because he said that she shouldn't have lost her job over this. He doesn't think that it should. He was just trying to take a video to show, like, what is this woman doing? Like, I'm not doing anything to her. And it ended up with her, you know, clearly being seen as someone who was trying to threaten the life of a man, because calling a police officer falsely when someone is not doing something to you and then pointing out that they're Black is basically threatening that person's life. And so now there's a law that was passed making false 9/11 calls against protected class members a crime. So that's another, you know, reform. And then people are calling for defunding of police, which is not as radical as it sounds. We have a culture of punishment in our criminal justice system in this country. And a lot of people don't know that law enforcement in the South began as slave patrol. It was teams of people who were hired to recapture escaped slaves. And when slavery was abolished, the police ended up enforcing segregation, like Jim Crow laws, for the most minor infractions. And so today, police disproportionately use force against Black people, and Black people are more likely to be arrested. And that history of how policing began is ingrained into our law enforcement. So when people get nervous about defunding the police, like there's just going to be all this violent crime happening, the sort of response to that is, well, we criminalize so much in this country. There's activities that you might not advise people to do. People might not advise their children to do some of these activities, but it certainly is a totally different thing to put someone in a prison for doing something. And so advocates of defunding the police have argued for reallocating those funds to support marginalized communities. They've said that defunding police will reduce the ability for law enforcement to have resources that can harm our communities, and reinvest those dollars to social services for domestic violence, homelessness, mental health. Those are three things that police are often the first responders to. And so defunding just means using those same dollars to fund schools, hospitals, housing, food, and targeted communities. All those things lead to increased public safety.
Okay, so from all of that, I wanted to ask you two follow-up questions. The first one relates to the differences in the voices that races have. So the white voice versus the Black voice in he said, she said kind of situation in which one person's word is held against another person's. And I wanted to ask your thoughts on how that influences victims. So if a Black woman was a victim of a crime, or a Black male was a victim of a crime, how that would influence the police's response if a white person was a perpetrator or someone of a more privileged status was a perpetrator. And just your thoughts on that kind of influence and how that affects our society.
Yeah, that's a really terrific question. Just in like some of our cases, when we are approached by clients to look into a conviction that they say they were innocent of, you know, I've seen our clients of color from the moment they're arrested, even before their arrest, they face racial animus. And so many of our clients, before they're even arrested, were on police radar for something totally separate, like trespass, or somebody may have been known to use drugs, and so they are under an order not to go into the housing projects, and they may have gone into the housing projects. And so that person, you know, because there was a murder in the area, they were targeted, and the police or the prosecutors did very little investigation. They were completely indifferent to whether they got the right guy. And it even evinced an outlook by the state of, well, if he didn't do this murder, he probably did something else. And so it really impacts the way investigations are pursued. In one of our clients' trials, which was in 1992, the defense attorney actually in his closing argument said, it was very eerie because we were working on this case right after Trump was elected. And so in his closing argument in 1992, he said, Donald Trump's mother's purse was stolen last week in 1992. You had the NYPD searching here, there, everywhere. Everybody was on it. Everybody was on this case. And you look at this case, and he said, no one did a damn thing to investigate this case. No one cared. And he was saying no one cared about the victim too. The victim was a Black woman. the two men who were ultimately convicted were Black men, and my client is a 6'3", 220-pound Black man. He is probably the nicest person I have ever met in my life, but when he walks down a street, people are frightened of him. And so he was saying, like, no one did a damn thing because the whole, state office, whether prosecutors or police, just didn't care to do basic investigation, things that a third grader would know to do to investigate a crime. Didn't happen. And so I think it affects a lot of people, whether you are accused of a crime or the victim of a crime. I think race matters.
Definitely. So correct me if I'm wrong, but in many of the cases that you work with, especially with the exoneration, there's usually an amount of money given to the person exonerated as somewhat of a compensation for the time that they've spent in prison, correct?
So we're a nonprofit organization, and we work on identifying people who are innocent and trying to overturn their criminal convictions. It's a separate civil proceeding when somebody is seeking compensation for their time wrongfully convicted and imprisoned. But you raise a great point, because there are a number of states that have compensation laws that range from, some states quantify, how much they believe you are warranted per year, and some put a cap of 50,000, some put, in the six figures. And so, I'm sure you can interview people and say, how much would you think you deserve for being in prison as an innocent person for 20 years? And most people would say it's priceless. Like, you can't just put a number on it. But in addition to those laws, you can file a federal civil rights lawsuit against the city and individual officers for your wrongful imprisonment. But it's very, very, very challenging to try to get money from those lawsuits. Many of our clients have, but in order to get money under the compensation law, if your state even has a compensation law, you usually have to prove innocence. And actual innocence, a prosecutor sometimes is very loath to even use that word. So if they don't say actual innocence, you might have to prove it a different way. And somebody might say, well, we don't know if you're actually innocent, even though there's new evidence in this case. You probably wouldn't be convicted today, but that doesn't mean you're actually innocent. So that's a barrier to trying to get that money. And a lot of people who try to file a federal civil rights lawsuit to try to get money that way, some of our clients have gotten millions of dollars against the city that they were from, but a lot of people have not, and you have to actually prove a misconduct. You can't just prove that you're innocent, but you have to prove that somebody engaged in official misconduct. And what's shocking is, like, to put an innocent person in prison, you usually do engage in misconduct to do that. But that's a long answer to your question, but just to say that it is something that is not automatic. A lot of people are released from prison and the prison gives them $20.
And based on that, like, what do you think that says about American society as a whole, if we're able to create these laws and create these limits and prices on life, on time for these people, and especially for African Americans who have previously, worked in servitude and slavery, and then through the Jim Crow laws have constantly been oppressed in the past? What are your thoughts on that price that we put on life and on time?
I mean, I think we can really measure a society by how we treat the most marginalized. And even for clients who, many of our clients are white. And what I've noticed in cases of clients who are white is they had something very, very, very different about them that led to, it wasn't, sometimes somebody makes a mistake. There's an eyewitness. She said she thought this was the guy and she was wrong. But in many cases, it's something much more onerous than that. And I have a case where a woman was targeted when everything pointed to one of her many ex-boyfriends as committing this horrendous crime. And they went to the state mental hospital and targeted our client, who had a severe mental illness, and forced a false confession out of her. And we now have evidence that the real perpetrator was actually a cop. We have cases of other white clients where there was either a mental illness or some sort of allegation that they were devil worshippers or engaging in witchcraft or something totally out there. And so, you know, I think that the fact that we incarcerate so many more people and we haven't actually reduced crime in this country is really telling as to what kind of society we have really just devolved into and haven't actually, like I said, haven't actually come forward in any sort of major change except to have this new type of slavery.
And you mentioned like the reduction of crime in this country. Do you think, given the current political climate and all the reforms that are happening, that that's like a realistic goal, even with all these prejudices and wrongful convictions and all the injustices that occur in the process?
Whether crime will be reduced?
Yeah, like how realistic that goal is with all these injustices happening.
You know, I think that when we look at crime, you know, it's very, and I haven't really studied actually crime statistics, but I think a lot of it is linked to poverty, disenfranchisement, and other societal issues. And so once those issues are actually explicitly addressed, I think that can then, you know, help with reduction of crime. But I don't think that those issues are what this country or what our officials or state officials or federal officials, except for maybe very few, are focused on. And so I'd like to be optimistic, but I think that it's a lot of the change that's happening now, which I think is at least bringing to the forefront some of these, you know, longstanding issues, can then lead to people saying, okay, well, instead of police, why don't we have social workers? Instead of, you know, I'm not saying get rid of the entire, you know, law enforcement apparatus, but in terms of certain things that police are designed to address, it makes more sense to have other professionals address those matters.
And with your experience in this work, you've dealt with people who have been previously convicted like decades before. And I just wanted to ask you, how has the criminal justice system changed within those past few decades to help you, exonerate these victims and have that DNA evidence and that proper, justice that the people that deserve?
You know, I was just watching a couple nights ago, Just Mercy, which actually is now playing for free in the month of June. And it is a documentary about Brian Stevenson, who started the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama, where he works on cases of people who are on death row in Alabama and life on parole. And what was remarkable from watching that, which was a documentary about a particular case that he had in 1987, what was remarkable was how little had changed. And, you know, I think that one of the things that is changing is the awareness building. And so when you see, you know, whether it's Netflix, whether it's, you know, people are following more, what the work of the Innocence Project, more and more people are recognizing that this is not like a one-off situation, but it is a phenomenon, that this is a systematic problem. And it's also highlighted a lot of other problems in our criminal justice system that may not specifically relate to wrongful convictions, but it's, you know, once you shine a light on somebody's wrongful conviction, it then puts people's attention on other problematic issues in our prisons and jails. So for example, cash bail, like if somebody is being arrested for a crime, even something like a traffic. So there are stories around the country of, you know, for example, a mother was, had like a traffic fine and she hadn't paid a bunch of her fines. And so she had to pay like a $750 ticket. She couldn't afford it. So they put her in jail because she couldn't pay a fine. Now she had 7 children. So how is she going to be able to support her children? Who's going to take care of her kids? She lost her job. And jails are basically becoming debtors' prisons. So people who are taken away from their communities, again, disproportionately poor people of color, because rich people like Harvey Weinstein are able to pay their $1 million bail when they're, being accused of, grave sexual assaults. But this is like a fine that somebody couldn't pay. And as a result, they're being put in a jail. So these jails are really just money-making institutions. So I think one thing that is, changing is the awareness building is starting, but we are, a long way before we can achieve true racial equity in this country.
You mentioned that, jails are these money-making institutions and they've been built in that way so that, more people going in will obviously make the people who are in charge more money. Do you think that the goal should be to reform these prisons, or should we abolish the current system and kind of start fresh with something much better and less based on these, injustices and inequalities and making money off of the racial injustices?
So, I mean, there's plenty of abolitionists who don't believe in prison. And I just feel like it's a non-starter with like this country. So like just starting from the position of, okay, there's violent crime and it's going to be a long way before you can go from having more people in prison than like, most quote unquote advanced countries to abolishing them outright. But I just think that, once we start to make some changes, whether it's, recognizing that police need to be held accountable, and just like when a civilian is going to be charged with a crime for hurting someone, police should also not be immune from that. I think that, sorry, I totally lost my train of thought, but yeah, sorry, I just lost exactly what I was about to say.
No, sorry. So I just want to transition into something like more of what we can do as, South Asians, as the immigrant community. Um, in the previous webinar, Sheikhs Ali David and Saeed Abdul Sajid emphasized the importance of education in the advancement of understanding in interracial conflicts and conversations. How has your education and your dedication to your work influenced your perspective as a South Asian Muslim on the racial inequalities that Black people face in this country?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because I was thinking of working it into this at some point. But, as Muslims, and I'm personally just closer to my faith than I am to, when I think about my identity, I just, I personally, like, my identity is more, I think about Islam and Muslims more than, being South Asian, but that's just my personal sort of outlook. But when I, think about the South Asian community, and this is a problem in a lot of communities that are being held up as like the model minority community. Like, look at our Muslims, like they are in professional institutions, they are in top, universities and this and that. And that kind of minimizes the racism that we see against other marginalized groups. But as Muslims, we are one of the most targeted, vilified groups in the nation, probably in the world, like at certain times, more than others. And we need to actively support other communities of color, especially the Black community, but we don't. And we, in our own community, and I'm speaking to any uncles and aunties out there, have rampant anti-Blackness. We have, rampant racism against the Black community in our community. We need to tackle our own discomfort with racially marginalized groups and acknowledge that we have those prejudices. I went to a lecture where this woman was talking about implicit bias, and she said, all of us have racial prejudices. And she told us about an example of something that she did that she didn't even realize she was doing. And she said, my mother is Black, my father's Korean, and I can't believe that I was, had this unconscious bias or conscious bias. And so she said, any one of you who thinks that you don't have any racial prejudices, you're probably the worst. And so I was reading a quote that someone sent that said, the first thing to freedom is recognizing that you have a colonized mind, and everything you have learned has been taught to you by a white supremacist, a capitalist, or someone with a patriarchal frame of mind. And I think that that is 100% true. I look back at my mentors, I look back at my mentors, and most of them have been white men, or in Sunday school, men, brown men, but mostly men. And men may not realize that they contribute implicitly or explicitly to the subjugation of women with, little asides they make, little, actions they take. And they have their own conscious or unconscious reasons to prevent women's empowerment. And so we have to recognize that we grew up with these assumptions. We grew up with these prejudices, whether they're explicit prejudices. You cross the street when you see a Black man, or an implicit prejudice where somebody clutches their purse when a Black man walks close to them, and we have to think about what communities we were taught are presumptively dangerous, because there are many people who were taught that the men in our communities are presumptively dangerous. And so we have to start confronting those prejudices and assumptions. And it's not our fault. And it's not our fault that we learn those biases. It's, nobody grows up, nobody's born racist, but these are things that you acquire as you grow up. And even though I'm saying it's not our fault that we have acquired those biases, it is our fault when we now know we have those biases and don't start to do anything to counteract those biases. So I think that's one thing that everybody can do. Like, you don't need to go to get up and go to a protest. But you can at least think about some of that. I do think that parents make choices when they put their children in certain schools, and they say, well, these are the better schools, which really means these are the white neighborhoods where like the better schools are. And so it's important to start from a very foundational level. But I do see, like, if a Hindu person would come and support our right to build a mosque, how many Muslims in our community would go support that Hindu person's right to build a temple? And I think people need to differentiate the right to do something which you're defending from the actual belief. You may not believe in somebody else's lifestyle or belief systems, but they certainly should have the right to believe them without fear of persecution, just like we should.
So going off of that, what do you think that what steps should we take in order to make those differences to those inherent prejudices, especially for future generations? Obviously, self-reflection is important, as you've mentioned, but what can we actively do so that we can make sure that this does not continue onwards and we are able to contribute positively to our own community, as well as communities in a more interracial and interfaith basis?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things. So, and I'm not even going to be thinking of the best ones, but just in terms of friendships and like I think about when a lot of people in our community grow up, like you have your school friends and you have your Islamic Center friends. And, it's important to, think about friendships as not just being like the Desi friends and the white friends, but also, making sure that you have in your, orbit, people from many different like racial groups, because I feel like how is it that anybody is going to learn about, I've heard stories where like somebody's little sister like was shocked the first time she saw a Black man because she'd never seen a Black man. And so, we are lucky to live in a very diverse part of the state, where I think that, making sure to join, whether it's join the Black Law Students Association when you're not Black. Like I've had people join the Muslim Law Students Association when they weren't Muslim, and they did some of the best advocacy, and they were alienated when somebody made a comment about not supporting another group's petition or right because they didn't believe in something underlying that group. And that's actually what motivated that person to leave the Muslim Law Association. So I think, sometimes doing things like that, like the outreach that we would want to do for our community, I think we have to start taking part in other student groups as students that like I never even thought about when I was a student. Like I would only join, a Muslim students group or South Asian group, and it would never occur to me to, do that. But then when I had friends who grew up in very very racially diverse communities and school districts, they had a better understanding of, some of the struggles that those communities had experienced. And I do feel like even as Muslims, like you mentioned, I represented men who were in prison in Guantanamo for, they were in prison for a decade. And I teach my students, like, whatever work you want to do in the future, whether it's you want to help the Latino community, you want to help your the LGBT community, you want to help, you want to do immigrants' rights work, whatever work you want to do, it's important to know the struggles of those who came before. And it's really, we're building on the work that so many people from the civil rights movement have started. And if you don't understand the racial injustice that sparked a lot of the work that has been done for decades, it's doing a disservice to your own community, because a lot of that work is very beneficial to helping a lot of other communities.
We have a question from our comments. It's, what is necessary to see some real change in the systems? Is it more of defunding the police? Is it getting rid of police brutality or changing reforms? And what explicitly can be done so that we can see these changes that we hope for in these movements?
I mean, there's a lot of different things that can be done. Like legally, there's, there's different standards for when a cop can stop a person. Let's say somebody's, driving and there's a traffic stop and you can stop the person. Like, you can't automatically search somebody unless you have, you meet a particular standard. And so, and depending on the situation, there's like a standard called reasonable suspicion, and other places there's a standard called probable cause. And so largely with like the Black community, like cops got away with saying he made a furtive gesture, which could be anything. Like, and a lot of that is, Black boys are taught from a very young age to, not ever say anything against the cops. Like, cop stops you, you don't fight with them. You don't have, like, somebody may not have the privilege I do, where I might be able to like argue with someone and say, look, I have a First Amendment right to call you a bleep. Like, you can't arrest me for that. But like, if you're a Black boy, you're taught from a young age, like, not to respond in a particular way. And I think that has, gotten some traction in the law, not really as much as we would like, but some people are saying, like, the ways that police respond to people of color, and the sort of interpretations they make of somebody's very innocent hood, or, moving this way or moving that way, has a very explicit racial bias that is imbued into that has nothing to do with whether the person has actually engaged in anything problematic. So those are some legal things. I don't think that's probably addressing what this person has asked, but there are a lot of legal changes that can be made to make sure that there are individuals who are held accountable in police departments. There's a lot of efforts to hold prosecutors accountable that really has no traction, because they're immune from a lot of accountability for work that's being done on their own during their duty. But
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us today. This was really insightful and a very interesting perspective on the injustices in America. Jazakallah khair, and assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you.